With advanced new fighters like the next-generation air dominance platform now cruising their way towards service, it seems clear that the US is moving further away from dogfighting platforms and doubling down on beyond visual range engagements. But for many, this feels like deja vu. After all, didn't we already learn this lesson in Vietnam? Let's talk about what really happened in the dogfights over Southeast Asia, because America's problems were about a lot more than missing guns. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. Today, America prizes air superiority in its approach to warfare, but there's a growing sentiment among many within the defense apparatus that dogfights, or close-quarters air-to-air combat, are a thing of the past. Advanced sensors and highly effective air-to-air weapons that can reach beyond visual range targets all suggest that air combat will take place at longer and longer distances in the future, making the need for aerobatic air superiority jets a thing of the past. This sentiment can be found in statements made by modern fighter pilots all over the internet, but it might be best reflected in a post from F-16 pilot Rick Sheff that went viral in aviation circles shortly after it went up. I'll quote it here. "The Raptor is about as cool as it gets, and it is the greatest air superiority fighter the world has ever seen. But like the F-15C that it was originally designed to replace, it's an airplane without a real mission in modern conflict. When was the last time an American fighter killed another fighter in an air-to-air engagement? Go look it up. I'll wait." Now, aside from the 2017 engagement between a Super Hornet and a Syrian Su-22 attack aircraft, there's objectively some real truth to Sheff's statement. I mean, it does seem inevitable that dogfights of a sort will break out anytime two nations put a large volume of tactical aircraft into the same airspace. But it's also hard to deny that there have been no fights between global powers for the better part of 80 years now. But those who disagree with the idea that close-quarters air battles are a thing of the past would posit that this period of relative peace and stability in our world is the exception rather than the rule. They would argue that Vietnam is a good example of how dogfights occur when air powers tussle, and that we should be careful not to assume that the days of air powers going to war are over just because it hasn't happened lately. Now, I want to be clear up front that, in my opinion, there are valid points to argue on both sides of this debate, but it's important not to lose sight of the complexity of the air war over Vietnam when we're using it as the foundation for an argument about dogfighting. The truth is, America's difficulties over Vietnam can't be summed up in a single sentence about a lack of guns in the F-4 or the failures of any particular missile platform. America's troubles in the skies over Vietnam began well before the first shots of the conflict were ever fired, and they continued well into the fighting. Some of the issues were technological, others were bureaucratic and even political. The truth is, America lost aircraft and pilots over Vietnam not because of a single incorrect conclusion like dogfights are over, but rather because of a litany of errors that were largely made with the best of intentions. There are lessons to be learned from the dogfights of Vietnam, but it's important that we look at them with clear eyes to ensure that we're learning the right ones. But before we can talk about those lessons, we need to establish a baseline of understanding. So let's talk about just how bad the air war over Vietnam was. During this conflict, American fighter pilots saw a significant downturn in kill-to-loss ratios as compared to figures from the Korean War. Some argue that US pilots over Korea came home with a 10-to-1 kill ratio, or 10 enemy fighters shot down for every 1 US fighter lost. But that figure was originally specific to the F-86 Sabre, and nevertheless, modern historians believe it to be inflated. Real figures, it seems, are likely closer to a still very impressive 8-to-1 instead. At times during the Vietnam War, on the other hand, that ratio had dropped to less than 1-to-1. That means that during some stretches of this fight, the North Vietnamese were shooting down more American fighters than they were losing. Now, it's important to remember that the overall ratio was significantly better than that, probably closer to 5.5-to-1 across the total force. But the harsh realities of air combat over Southeast Asia can perhaps be best appreciated when looking at the hard numbers. Between February of 1962 and October of 1973, the U.S. lost 1,737 fixed-wing aircraft in combat, with another 517 going down to other issues over Vietnam. Throughout the entirety of the war, it was exceedingly rare for a week to pass without an American aircraft being lost in the fight, and at times, it happened on a daily basis. The U.S. Air Force lost 40% of its entire fleet of F-105 Thunder Chiefs over Vietnam. On top of that, a bit more than 12%, about 1 out of every 8 of F-4s built for all services, met their end over Vietnam's jungles. Now, all that likely isn't surprising to those who are familiar with the air war over Vietnam, but something that might surprise you is that the Air Force and the Navy were not taking these losses lying down. They were actively working on this the whole time. In fact, the Air Force had improved its tactics so dramatically over the course of the war that in the final 5 months of it, its fighter pilots were actually downing the enemy at a rate of 15-1. Now, talking about how much things improved by the final months of the conflict might seem like historical nitpicking, but the truth is, picking nits is important for the sake of an accurate historical record. But it still doesn't erase the fact that in the late 50s and early 60s, America really did seem to incorrectly believe that close-quarters dogfights were a thing of the past, thanks in large part to the advent of, this'll probably sound familiar, improved sensors and highly capable air-to-air missiles. Such was the belief that new air-to-air weapons like the AIM-9 Sidewinder and AIM-7 Sparrow could render previous forms of dogfighting obsolete that America's Mach 2 capable F-4 Phantom II came all the way through production without so much as an onboard cannon, which was considered standard equipment for all fighters until that time. And this is what you'll usually hear people cite when they talk about America's Vietnam dogfighting failures. I'm going to quote John Cheshire, who flew 197 combat missions in the Phantom during 2 tours in Vietnam. That was the biggest mistake on the F-4. Bullets are cheap and tend to go where you aim them. I needed a gun, and I really wished I had one. It wasn't long before that dogfights are dead line of thinking put American pilots into some pretty bad situations, as they tried to do battle with the notably slower and less advanced MiG-15s, 17s, 19s, and 21s that were swarming the skies over Vietnam. The MiG's ability to take tight turns and orient their noses at the faster-moving American jets before they could swing around gave them the opportunities to score gun kills. And to make matters worse, America's new missiles didn't always work as advertised, which cost pilots valuable opportunities to down their opponents when they had the chance. Now, to be clear, a lack of guns did not do the F-4 any favors, but it was just one of many variables that eventually sort of conspired against American pilots over Vietnam. As explained by Benjamin Lambeth in his book published by Cornell Studies, The Transformation of American Air Power, America's emphasis on winning the nuclear fight against the Soviet Union, fielding fast-moving fighters that were designed specifically to intercept Soviet aircraft at long distances, or to carry heavy nuclear payloads into Soviet territory, all left American pilots at a disadvantage against harder cornering and slower platforms like the MiG-17 and MiG-21. But the disadvantages created by this emphasis on deterring nuclear conflict extended way beyond missing guns or turn rate. The F-4 Phantom II had its strengths, but it offered poor visibility to the rear from inside the cockpit, making it tough to keep an eye on slower-moving opponents as they passed. To make matters worse, its J-79 engines, which could propel the F-4 well past Mach 2, were known to produce a heavy smoke trail when not flying under afterburner. Contemporary reports suggest that the smoke trail left by the F-4's engines would extend for as far as 30 miles, giving Vietnamese fighters and crews on the ground ample opportunity to spot and track the American jets as they flew through contested airspace. Once the fight was on, American F-4s had a very narrow window of opportunity to leverage any advantage they might have. According to one declassified performance comparison between American and North Vietnamese aircraft, quote, "Only in range and first-shot capability does the F-4C enjoy a substantial advantage over the MiG-21 throughout the envelope." In other words, if the F-4 didn't win a fight with its first shot, it was probably flying at a disadvantage from then on. Of course, that's where problems with America's air-to-air missiles became all the more evident. Between 1965 and March of 1968, of the 224 AIM-7s fired at enemy aircraft during combat, only 20 resulted in kills. That made for a success rate of just 8.9%. Other missiles did fare better, but not a whole lot. The AIM-4 recorded a success rate of 10.7%, and the AIM-9B Sidewinder came in at 16%. The common perception that American air-to-air missiles failed to function as well as expected during Vietnam is entirely accurate. But it's certainly worth noting that the AIM-9 Sidewinder matured a great deal as a result of this conflict, and later, the AIM-9L that would result provided the Brits an 80% success rate during the Falklands War. And it's also not exactly accurate to put all the blame on the hardware. Aircrew failures, like not keeping the target illuminated by radar until impact, were faulted for about 33% of the AIM-7's misses. It's also important to note that these weapons weren't designed for this sort of a fight. They were really intended to engage Soviet bombers at long ranges, not win dogfights over the jungles of Southeast Asia. But bad as all that might sound, there were still more problems facing American fighter pilots over Vietnam, particularly in the form of rules of engagement and dogfighting tactics. The AIM-7 Sparrow air-to-air missile was capable of engaging enemy fighters at ranges as far as 12 miles when intercepting head-on, which could have given the F-4 Phantom that first shot opportunity it needed to win more fights. But the rules of engagement American pilots were given required that they make visual identification of targets prior to launching a weapon. Visual identification, of course, can only occur within visual range. So, while American pilots had beyond visual range weapons at their disposal, they were effectively barred from using them. And of course, once pilots had closed to within visual range, they were now at a disadvantage because of the MiG's tighter turn radius and guns. But this limitation wasn't just a problem when it came to weapons employment. It also eliminated the American opportunity for surprise in its air attacks. American fighters needed to be close enough to see their enemies before they could fire, but that obviously meant their Vietnamese opponents could see them too. The F-4 was faster and had longer reach than its opponents, but policy forced American pilots to surrender those advantages to the less advanced MiGs they were fighting. But more than just policy, let's talk strategy and tactics. The North Vietnamese famously produced far more flying aces, or pilots with at least 5 kills, than America's Air Force or Navy during this war. But that fact dismisses an important difference between these two aviator groups. American pilots were rotated into and out of the fight, whereas their opponents obviously continued to fly combat sorties over their home turf throughout the conflict's entirety. It's sort of like comparing the football stats between one player's rookie season and another player's entire career. When the war began, America sent its most highly experienced aviators into the fight. But by 1966, the Air Force was sending pilots home after either 100 missions over North Vietnam or 1 year of combat over South Vietnam. While this rotation was valuable for combating burnout and to maintain morale, it also produced a pressing need for new pilots in the cockpit at frequent intervals. As a result, many pilots arriving in country didn't have any actual tactical experience behind the stick before they were just thrust into the thick of it. Air Force F-4s were further hampered by bad tactics, as they often flew in a World War II-era formation referred to as a fluid 4. This formation resulted in wingmen being too close, between 1,500 and 2,000 feet away at a 45-degree angle, to provide any real protection for the other aircraft, and it effectively limited the attacking portion of the formation to just the flight leader. Using 4 aircraft to deliver 1 jet's worth of fight was obviously not a great strategy, and it stood out in contrast to the Navy's Fluid 2 formations of 2 aircraft that could both leverage their full loadouts. This time, I'll quote former Air Force fighter pilot Marshall Mickle, who was a flight leader in Vietnam. "The wingman was always just another plane in the air. I would have preferred to have gone into Route Package 6 under the conditions we were operating, with 2 highly qualified crews flying Navy Fluid 2 rather than 4. I had to spend 90% of my time just keeping somebody in the flight from getting shot down, and couldn't go about the business of a MiG combat air patrol." Okay, so I think I've made my point about hardware, user error, bureaucracy, and tactics, but believe it or not, I'm still not done. Because the way we trained fighter pilots going into Vietnam did not do America any favors either. Before the Vietnam War broke out, the US had placed a huge emphasis on safety during training. So much so that it all but forbade the realistic training pilots needed to win dogfights over Vietnam. And to make matters worse, most of the training F-4 pilots got in air combat was done against other F-4s, which, as we've discussed, flew absolutely nothing like the MiGs they'd be squaring off against over Southeast Asia. This lack of realistic training meant many American fighter pilots were sent into the fight with very little dogfighting experience at all, and next to none against the types of aircraft they'd be fighting. Addressing this serious shortcoming eventually led to the establishment of the Air Force's first ever aggressor squadron, a group of pilots flying jets like the T-38 and later the F-5E Tiger, tasked with mirroring opponent tactics to provide a more realistic idea of what air combat would be like. Not long after that, the Air Force held its first ever Red Flag training exercise, a massive operation meant to simulate the complexity of air combat. And it was born to help rectify the lack of experience Air Force pilots had prior to heading into combat. The Navy, of course, had to make its own significant changes in how it prepared pilots for air warfare. In 1969, the US Navy created the Navy Fighter Weapons School, which later became known as the Navy Strike Fighter Tactics Instructor Program, but most of us know it simply as Top Gun. And while there's obviously room for debate as to what will come of dogfights in the future, the establishment and continued investment into both Red Flag and Top Gun following the Vietnam War prove without a shadow of a doubt that the US learned some valuable lessons from that fight that went on to help America become the most dominant air power in the world today. We can learn some valuable lessons from the war in Ukraine, like that advanced air defense systems don't render aircraft obsolete, and that air combat is bound to happen from time to time. But maybe the most important lesson we can learn from this conflict is that we should always take our assumptions with a grain of salt. And that's true whether you're in the camp that thinks dogfights are over, or you're in the camp that thinks they'll keep on going just the way they always have. The truth is, trying to predict the way the next great conflict will play out is almost always a losing effort, but the best we can do is continue to invest in new technologies, continue to emphasize the importance of training, and be ready to pivot if we realize our assumptions were wrong. And on that ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. I want to thank Hector Tinoco for taking over editing duties for me on this episode. And make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.